everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive.
Glad to be here.
Today we're going to be tackling something that I think is pretty relevant to a lot of us, which is the whole idea of identity in the modern world.
Right.
And how it intersects with, spirituality. I know spirituality can sound a little bit...
Woo.
Yeah, woo-woo, a little out there, but stick with us here.
Yeah.
We're not going to be... chanting mantras or anything like that.
No crystals today.
No crystals, no incense. This is actually based on a really interesting academic paper that we found.
Right.
It explores two very different worldviews. One that we probably bump into every day, which is materialism.
Yeah.
Kind of the dominant way of looking at the world in a lot of societies.
Material world.
And then another perspective that you may or may not be familiar with, which is drawn from the Baha'i teachings about the soul.
And it's really fascinating to put those two side by side.
Yeah, because what really caught my eye was how this paper uses those two contrasting views to try and understand the whole identity crisis thing that so many people seem to be feeling these days.
A lot of angst out there.
A lot of angst. Yeah, have you ever felt that,
Yeah.
You're just kind of a cog in a machine?
Oh, yeah.
You're working hard, maybe you're even achieving things.
Going through the motions.
But there's still this kind of emptiness inside.
Absolutely. And the paper actually has a term for that. It calls it the existential void.
Oh, wow.
And argues that it's really connected to the rise of this materialism that we were talking about.
Okay, so it's not just people liking nice things.
Right.
It's like a whole worldview that says matter is all there is.
Right. That the physical world is all there is.
And if that's the case, then things can get pretty bleak pretty quickly.
Well, yeah, because if we believe that we're just biological beings,
right?
Just,
a
product of random chance.
Just atoms bouncing around.
Yeah, then logically, there's no inherent meaning to life. Right,
Well.
So where do we go from there?
Yeah, and so the paper talks about how this worldview, this materialist worldview, often leads to either nihilism, which is, the belief that everything is meaningless.
Nothing matters?
Nothing matters, yeah. Or hedonism.
Right.
Which is kind of the opposite.
Just chasing pleasure.
Just chase the good times, eat, drink, and be merry, because tomorrow we die.
Yeah, and while that might sound fun for a little while,
it gets old.
It doesn't really offer that lasting fulfillment that I think most of us are looking for.
Makes sense. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like that old saying,
right?
You can have everything and still feel empty.
Yeah, you can have all the material possessions, all the success in the world.
Accolades, and still just feel like something is missing.
Exactly, and that's what we're trying to unpack here.
Right, so we've got this kind of existential void situation.
Yeah.
Fueled by materialism. Okay, now the paper also talks about this idea of a collapse of boundaries.
Interesting term.
Yeah, and when I first read that, I was like, what does that even mean?
Some very abstract.
Very abstract, but I'm guessing it's something that we all kind of experience on some level.
Probably.
Yeah, so what does that actually look like, in a person's life? What does that mean, a collapse of boundaries?
So think about it this way. It's that feeling of not knowing who you are anymore. Because the external world keeps shifting what things mean. Like what defines success today?
Yeah.
What does it mean to be a good person?
Right.
Even basic values seem to be up for debate constantly.
It changes so fast.
Yeah. So it's really hard to find that solid sense of self when everything around you is in flux.
It's like trying to build your identity on quicksand.
Yeah, exactly. It's constantly shifting.
No wonder so many people feel lost and confused.
Right, and that's where this other perspective that we were talking about, the Baha'i view of the soul, comes into play.
Okay, so let's talk about that. Yeah. This soul idea. When I first saw that in the source material, I was a little hesitant, to be honest.
I get it.
I thought, oh no, this is getting into preachy territory.
Yeah, that's a common reaction.
But it's actually a lot more philosophical than I expected.
Yeah, it's less about religion and more about a framework for understanding ourselves and the universe differently.
Okay, so how does this Baha'i perspective differ from what we've been talking about so far?
Well, for starters, it kind of flips the script on our usual way of thinking.
Okay.
Instead of seeing ourselves primarily as physical beings,
right.
The Baha'i teachings emphasize the soul as our true essence.
Okay, so it's not just about having a soul.
Right.
It's about the soul being the core of who we are.
Exactly. Think of it like this. Imagine your soul as the operating system of your being.
Okay.
Your body is the hardware. Your thoughts and emotions are the software. But the soul is that underlying code that makes it all run. And here's the key. The soul is eternal. It exists before our physical birth and continues to evolve after we die.
Whoa. Okay.
So that quote we mentioned earlier from the Hidden Words comes to mind.
Yeah, the one that says, O son of man, thou art my dominion, and my dominion perisheth not. Wherefore fearest thou thy perishing?
That really gets to the heart of it, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's powerful.
If our true essence is eternal and doesn't perish, that changes everything.
It does.
It means our purpose isn't limited to just our time on Earth.
Right.
There's a bigger picture unfolding.
I can see how that could be a powerful antidote to that feeling of being lost and insignificant that we were talking about.
Yeah, it gives you a different foundation, a different perspective.
Okay, but let's be real here. How does this actually play out in everyday life?
Right.
I mean, if I'm going through a tough time, like a job I hate or a relationship falling apart, does believing in a soul really change anything?
That's a question a lot of people wrestle with. And the paper actually addresses this directly.
Okay.
It's not about magically fixing our problems.
Right.
Instead, it shifts how we approach them. Instead of seeing challenges as just roadblocks to happiness, you begin to see them as opportunities for growth.
Okay.
For developing qualities like resilience, compassion, and understanding.
So even when things are difficult, there's still a sense of purpose,
right,
of moving forward on this journey of the soul.
Precisely. It's not about denying the pain or the difficulty,
right,
but finding meaning within it. And this can make a huge difference in how we navigate the ups and downs of life.
Okay, so we've got these two very different frameworks here.
Yeah.
The purely material view, where we're essentially biological machines.
Just cogs in the machine.
Yeah. And then this soul perspective, where we're eternal beings on a journey of growth. So let's break that down a bit. Like, how would these contrasting views play out in, say, someone's career?
Okay, so if you're operating from that purely material perspective, your career might become all about climbing the ladder, achieving status, accumulating wealth.
The corner office.
Yeah, the big paycheck.
Right.
And your sense of worth might be tied to your job title or how much money you're making.
Which could leave you feeling pretty empty if you hit a setback.
Right.
Or if you reach that top and find it wasn't what you expected.
Exactly. Or what it's cracked up to be.
Right. And that's where the burnout comes in. Right?
Absolutely. That's where you start to feel like, is this all there is? Is this what I've been working for?
What's the point?
Right.
But from the perspective of the soul, how might that look different?
Your work might be seen as an opportunity for service.
Okay.
For developing your talents, for contributing something meaningful to the world.
So it's not just about what you get out of it.
Right.
But also what you put into it.
Yeah.
And how your work connects to something larger than yourself.
Exactly. And the paper actually gives this fascinating example of a young professional who was feeling completely burnt out.
Oh, okay.
They were successful by all the traditional measures.
The corner office, the big paycheck.
Yeah, they had it all.
But still felt unfulfilled.
Deeply unfulfilled, yeah.
Wow.
And they started exploring this idea of the soul and seeing their work as a form of service.
Okay.
And it really shifted their whole perspective.
How so?
Their job became less about climbing that ladder and more about using their skills to make a positive impact. And that change brought them this renewed sense of purpose and satisfaction.
So it wasn't about changing their job.
Right.
It was about changing how they viewed their job.
Exactly. Changing their perspective, their mindset.
That's a great example of how this can be applied in a real-world situation.
Yeah, it's not just theory. It's something you can actually put into practice.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit here.
Sure.
What about relationships?
Yeah.
How might these two worldviews shape how we approach our connections with others?
Well, from that purely materialist standpoint, relationships might be primarily about what you get out of them. They might be transactional, based on mutual benefit, or even superficial attraction.
So more about what's in it for me.
Yeah. And that can lead to a lot of dissatisfaction because relationships are inherently complex.
Right.
And require more than just a tit-for-tat approach.
Yeah, it's not a business deal.
Exactly.
But from the perspective of the soul, what does that look like?
Relationships become opportunities for growth.
Okay.
For developing qualities like love, compassion, and understanding. Each interaction becomes a chance to learn something about yourself and the world.
So it's not just about what the other person can do for you.
Right.
But what you can learn and grow from being in a relationship with them.
Exactly. It's about that mutual growth, that shared journey.
Okay.
And this perspective can also offer a lot of comfort and hope in dealing with loss and grief.
Oh, that's a heavy topic.
It is.
But it's definitely relevant to how we experience life.
Right. Death is a part of life.
So what does the paper say about grief from these two perspectives?
Well, if you view death as the absolute end, as just a biological process,
Right.
then grief can be incredibly overwhelming and difficult to process.
Yeah.
The loss feels permanent and irreplaceable,
Right.
which can leave you feeling devastated and alone.
I can see how that worldview could make grief even more painful.
Absolutely, it can be a very bleak outlook.
But the Baha'i teachings offer a different lens.
They
They view death not as the end,
Right.
but as a transition.
A transition to another realm of existence.
The soul continues on its journey.
Exactly.
And our connection to those we love
Yeah.
transcends physical limitations.
It's a deeper connection, a spiritual connection.
So even though the physical presence is gone,
Right.
the connection remains on a deeper level.
Yes. And this belief can offer a tremendous amount of solace and hope during that grieving process. It shifts the focus from the finality of death to the continuation of the soul's journey.
Okay, so we've explored how these two worldviews can shape how we approach work relationships and even grief.
And it's just the beginning.
Yeah, it seems like we're just scratching the surface here.
Absolutely. There's so much more to unpack.
Right. And in the next part of our deep dive,
Yeah.
we're going to go even deeper.
We're going to dive into some specific examples
Right from the paper.
of how these contrasting worldviews play out in real-life situations.
Oh, okay, so stay tuned for that.
See you in part 2.
All right, so we're back.
Part 2?
Part 2 of our deep dive into identity materialism, the soul, all the good stuff.
Big questions.
The big questions, yeah.
So where were we?
Well, we were talking about these two contrasting worldviews.
Right. Materialism versus the soul,
Materialism versus this Baha'i concept of the soul.
and how they might shape our experience of things like work and relationships and grief.
Right, and we were just starting to get into some real-life examples from the paper.
Yeah, the paper has some really compelling stories of how people are actually applying these ideas.
Yeah, so let's jump into one of those examples.
Okay.
The paper talks about this the student who was really struggling with their identity.
Classic college student dilemma.
Yeah, like, who am I? What am I doing with my life? All those big questions.
Especially in today's world with so many options and so much pressure.
Right, so much pressure from social media, from parents, from peers.
A lot to navigate.
It is, and the student was feeling really lost.
Lost in the sea of possibilities.
Yeah, and they were trying to figure out, what they wanted to major in, what kind of career they wanted to pursue.
Right, the classic, what do you want to be when you grow up question.
Exactly, and the paper talked about how the student was initially approaching this from a very materialistic perspective.
Okay, so they were looking at things like earning potential job security.
Yeah, like what's going to make me the most money?
What's going to give me the most stability?
Just going to impress people.
The external markers of success.
Right, but the more they focused on those things,
Yeah.
the more lost and anxious they felt.
Because those things are always changing.
Right, it's like chasing a moving target.
The goalposts keep shifting.
Yeah, and it's exhausting.
It is, and it's ultimately unsatisfying.
So what happened? How did they get out of that rut?
Well, they started exploring this idea of the soul
Okay.
and this concept of an eternal purpose that goes beyond just material success.
So instead of asking, what's going to make me the most money?
Right.
They started asking, what am I passionate about? What are my unique talents and gifts? How can I use those to contribute something meaningful to the world?
Yeah, those are much deeper questions.
Right, and it shifted their whole focus.
From external validation to internal motivation.
Yeah, and the paper says that this led to a profound sense of relief and clarity for this student.
Because they were no longer trying to fit themselves into a mold.
Right.
They were embracing their own unique path, their own journey of the soul.
That's powerful. I mean, it really highlights how these different worldviews can lead to very different outcomes.
Yeah, it's not just about intellectual concepts, it's about how we live our lives.
Okay, so we've talked about careers and we've talked about identity.
Right.
What about relationships?
Yes, the messy world of relationships.
The paper gives an example of a couple who was going through a really tough time.
Okay, every couple has their ups and downs.
Yeah, but this was like a major crisis point.
Yeah.
They were on the verge of breaking up.
So what was the issue?
Well, communication breakdowns, trust issues,
Yeah.
resentment, all the classic relationship challenges.
Like the stuff that can really erode the foundation of a relationship.
And the paper talks about how initially they were both approaching this from a very individualistic perspective.
Okay, so very me-focused.
Yeah, like, what am I getting out of this relationship? Are my needs being met? Am I happy?
Which can be a recipe for disaster.
Right, because it becomes a tug of war.
Yeah, two people pulling in opposite directions.
And no one's really winning.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But then something shifted.
What happened?
They were introduced to this idea of the soul.
Okay.
And they started to see their relationship through a different lens.
How so?
They realized that their connection wasn't just about fulfilling their individual needs. It was about a shared journey of growth.
Okay.
About supporting each other's spiritual development.
That's interesting.
Yeah. And it changed their whole approach to communication and conflict resolution.
In what way?
Instead of seeing disagreements as personal attacks,
Right.
they started to see them as opportunities for learning and understanding.
Okay.
They became more focused on listening to each other's perspectives, trying to see things from each other's point of view.
And did it work? Did they save their relationship?
The paper says that it did.
Wow.
It wasn't a magic fix,
Right.
but it gave them a new foundation, a new way of relating to each other.
So it wasn't just about fixing the problems.
It was about shifting their whole perspective on the relationship.
Right. And that's what allowed them to work through those challenges.
Exactly. They started seeing their relationship as a spiritual partnership.
That's powerful.
It is. And it's something that I think a lot of couples could benefit from.
Okay, so we've seen how these contrasting worldviews can play out in careers, in identity formation and relationships.
Right.
What about grief?
Ah, yes, that inevitable part of life.
The paper shares a story of a woman who had recently lost her husband.
Oh, that's heartbreaking.
Yeah, it was a sudden, unexpected loss,
Wow.
and she was devastated.
Of course.
And the paper talks about how initially she was struggling to find any meaning or solace in her grief.
It's hard to make sense of such a profound loss.
Yeah, and she was surrounded by people who were offering her condolences and support.
Right.
But a lot of the messages she was hearing were very much rooted in a materialistic worldview.
Okay, so things like, he's in a better place now, or time heals all wounds.
Yeah, those kind of platitudes.
Which can be well-intentioned,
Right.
but not always helpful.
Yeah, because they don't really address the depth of the pain.
Right. They can feel dismissive even.
Yeah, and this woman was feeling very alone in her grief.
Like no one understood what she was going through.
Exactly, but then she came across this idea of the soul and the concept of life after death.
Okay, so not the end, but a transition.
Right, and this resonated with her deeply.
Because it offered a sense of hope.
Yeah, it wasn't just about her husband's physical body being gone.
Right.
It was about his soul continuing on its journey.
And their connection transcending physical limitations.
And the paper says that this realization brought her a profound sense of peace and comfort.
Wow.
It didn't take away the pain of the loss.
Right. Grief is a process.
But it gave her a new way of understanding death.
And a new way of connecting with her husband's memory.
Right, it wasn't about denial.
It was about transformation.
Okay, so we've seen how these two contrasting worldviews can shape our experience of work relationships, identity formation, and even grief.
And it's fascinating how these ideas can impact our lives on such a fundamental level.
Right, and I think it's a testament to the power of perspective.
Yeah, how we choose to see the world can really make all the difference.
And that choice is always ours.
It is, and that's both empowering and daunting at the same time.
Okay, so as we wrap up this part of our deep dive,
Yeah.
what are some of the key takeaways that you think our listeners should keep in mind?
Well, I think the biggest one is that our worldview matters.
Right, it's not just some abstract philosophical concept.
It shapes how we experience everything.
How we approach challenges, how we relate to others, how we make sense of the world.
Exactly. And it's important to be aware of our own assumptions.
Right, to question what we believe and why we believe it.
Because sometimes our beliefs can hold us back.
Yeah, or lead us down paths that ultimately don't serve us.
Right. So it's worth exploring different perspectives.
Opening ourselves to new ideas.
Yeah, even if they seem a little out there at first.
Because you never know what you might discover.
You might find a new way of seeing the world that brings you more peace, more joy, more fulfillment.
And that's what this deep dive is all about.
About expanding our horizons.
Right, and challenging ourselves to think differently.
So that we can live more meaningful lives.
Okay, so in the next and final part of our deep dive, we're going to explore some practical steps.
Practical tips.
Yeah, that you can take to start applying these ideas in your own life.
So stay tuned for that.
Okay, so we're back for the final part.
part 3
of our deep dive into identity materialism, the soul.
All that good stuff.
All the good stuff. Yeah, so we've talked about how these contrasting worldviews,
Right.
materialism versus the Baha'i concept of the soul,
Right.
can really shape our experience of everything.
Yeah, from our careers to our relationships to how we deal with grief.
Right, and I think it's safe to say that we've all probably been operating from a more materialistic perspective.
At least to some extent. Yeah, it's kind of the default setting in our society.
Yeah, it's everywhere.
Yeah.
You know, it's in the media, it's in our education system.
It's the air we breathe.
Right, but what if
Yeah.
what if we could shift that perspective? What if we could start seeing the world through the lens of the soul?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is, and the paper actually offers some practical steps that we can take to do just that.
Okay, so let's get practical.
Yeah, let's talk about how we can actually apply these ideas in our everyday lives.
Give us the tools.
Right, so the first step is awareness.
Okay, so becoming aware of our own worldview.
Right, because we can't change something if we don't even know it's there.
Exactly. It's like trying to fix a leaky faucet without knowing where the leak is coming from.
Yeah. So how do we become more aware of our own worldview?
Well, one way is to pay attention to our thoughts,
Okay.
our beliefs, our values.
Like what kind of thoughts?
Well, for example, when you're faced with a challenge, what's your first reaction? Do you see it as a setback or an opportunity for growth?
Right.
When you're interacting with others, are you focused on what you can get from them or what you can contribute? When you think about your purpose in life, do you define it in terms of material success or something more meaningful?
Okay, so it's about noticing those patterns in our thinking.
Exactly. And once we start to see those patterns, we can start to question them.
Right, like why do I believe that? Is it serving me?
Yeah, and that leads us to the second step, which is questioning.
Okay, so we're aware of our worldview, and now we're questioning it.
Exactly. And this is where things can get a little uncomfortable.
Right, because we're challenging our own deeply held beliefs.
Yeah, but it's also where the real growth happens.
So how do we go about questioning our worldview?
Well, one way is to expose ourselves to different perspectives.
Okay, so read books.
Yeah, read books, listen to podcasts, have conversations with people who have different views than our own.
Step outside our echo chamber.
Exactly. And be willing to consider the possibility that we might be wrong.
That's humbling.
It is, but it's also liberating.
Because it opens us up to new possibilities.
Right. It allows us to see the world with fresh eyes.
Okay, so we've become aware of our worldview. We've questioned it.
What's next?
What's the third step?
The third step is to start aligning our actions with our new understanding.
Okay, so putting it into practice.
Yeah, walking the walk, not just talking the talk.
So what might that look like?
Well, it could be something as simple as changing our language.
Okay.
Instead of saying, I have to go to work,
Right.
we could say, I get to use my talents to contribute to the world.
I like that.
It's a subtle shift, but it can make a big difference in our attitude.
Right, because it's about reframing our experience.
Exactly. And it could also mean making bigger changes in our lives,
Like what?
like choosing a career that aligns with our values,
Okay.
or prioritizing relationships that support our spiritual growth, or finding ways to serve others.
So it's about making choices that reflect our new understanding of ourselves and the world.
Exactly. And it's a journey.
Right. It's not something that happens overnight.
It's a process of continuous growth and evolution.
And the paper emphasizes that this journey is ultimately about discovering our true selves
Right. Shedding those layers of materialism and ego,
and connecting with our eternal essence.
our soul.
And that's a pretty incredible journey to be on.
It is. And it's a journey that's available to all of us.
So as we wrap up this deep dive,
Yeah.
I want to leave you with this question.
Okay.
What if you are more than you think you are? What if there's a whole dimension of yourself that you haven't even tapped into yet?
The possibilities are endless.
They are. And I encourage you to explore those possibilities.
To embark on your own journey of the soul.
Because the world needs your unique gifts and talents.
And the world needs you to be your true, authentic self.
So go out there and shine.
Shine brightly.
And thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.